One framework, let's say, originates in India, and this is Indian political theory's biggest export in the shape of Maududi, who I think happens to be one of the 20th century's most influential political thinkers, if you just went by political influence, right? That is, in a sense, structured around the question, right, of what would a kind of modern form of Islamic constitutionalism look like, right? That's the debate in Pakistan, that's the debate in Egypt, that's the debate, in some senses, Saudi Arabia. There are different variations of Iran, right? This meta-narrative made certain claims, right? Some normative claims, some historical claims. So, just to give kind of examples, it's one of the most elaborately worked out political theories. I mean, the kind of the jurisprudential and philosophical sophistication of it is staggering in some way, right? But it's a political theory that begins with acknowledging the sovereignty of God, in part to say that if we don't acknowledge God as sovereign, what it will be replaced by is the domination of one person over another, right? It has a kind of theological account in the sense of equality, right? Then things get more interesting. It has a reading of the last 10th centuries of history. I think Iqbal's, in a sense, exemplifies it better, which basically argues that contrary to what liberalism thinks, right? So the liberal view of the religion, of the connection between religion and politics has always been that one of the reasons you separate church and state is because it also allows religion to flourish in all its authenticity, right? This was the 19th century reading of why in Europe there is a revolt against religion, because if religion and state are conflated, as they were in Catholic France, when people get upset at the state, they'll also revolt against the religion, right? So it's not just that it's in the interest of individual autonomy that you separate church and state, right? There's also actually, in a sense, a kind of a logic whereby religion begins to understand why it's important for this bifurcation to happen. But the diagnosis in this set of political theories, beginning with Maududi, is that that is actually a mistake. It's a mistake for two very different theoretical reasons. One, it's a mistake because the liberal claim that political secularization will not lead to whole-scale social secularization is simply false, right? That was Iqbal's critique of this separation of church and state. The second reason, theological reason, philosophical reason, actually normative reason, you can think about this reason even independently of theological commitments, is a persistent strain in 20th century political thought that opposes what you might call the liberal fragmentation of experience, right? So what do we mean by that? We often talk about liberalism in terms of individual rights and so on and so forth. Most of you have read Marx's Jewish Question. Marx is the first early critique of the liberal kind of critique of fragmentation. The idea behind fragmentation, best personified in Max Weber, is it is going to be our condition in the modern world that we simultaneously live out different modes of experience with their own individual logic, right? So the logic of the state is equality, mutual recognition, reciprocity. The logic of the market is a reciprocity of a different kind, right? Exchange, commodification, right? The logic of arts and aesthetics and the sphere of eroticism is, in a sense, subjectivism, right? Even modern art is about subjectivity. It's not about creating common public meanings. The state requires monopoly over violence and uses violence as an instrument. It's inherent in the nature of the state, which, of course, will also be in tension with an ethical mode of existence, where you actually think that the point of existence is to make everything ethically consistent, right? Now, liberalism's strongest claim was that under conditions of modernity, you cannot overcome this fragmentation of experience. So when Marx said there's a contradiction between the citizen and the producer, liberals' answer is that's exactly right. That's exactly how, in fact, Marx is the best, in a sense, I think, articulation of what that position is, right? But the argument, the core liberal argument was that the idea that experience is a unified whole, right, where we experience the world as a single whole without contradictions, that impulse is sociologically not possible. The only way you can produce this is by simplifying society and abridging freedoms, right? And it's actually humanly, normatively not desirable. We are destined to be fragmented creatures. And in a sense, liberalism is about managing the nature of this fragmentation in a way that can do justice to his ideas. But one of the most remarkable dividing lines in political thought is basically people who accept this fragmentation as a starting point and those who don't. Right? There have been critics on the left from this fragmentation. Right? So on this liberal view, these contradictions and hypocrisies, they are constitutive of a rich moral life. They are not objections against it. Right? In some forms, Marxism is one kind of critique, that you could imagine a historical process where all these contradictions are overcome, right? In a sense, the self is united with society in a seamless whole without contradiction, right? But the other challenge to it, and I think the most profound one was articulated in modern Islamic thought, was actually from the point of view of religious experience. You know, if you're interested in concepts like khudi, for example, right? How can you actually make sense of a concept like that if your social and ethical experience is destined to be fragmented in this way? Right? So this is serious political theory. I mean, it's not, right? So you had the sovereignty of God. You had a critique of the separation of church and state. You have a critique of the fragmentation of experience. And then the question, what political form can do justice to these normative claims, right? And very briefly, that's basically what kind of Maududi put on the table, a form of kind of theo-democracy, right? Where one of the things they all recognize that in the modern world, it is important that whatever political system you have, claim legitimacy in the name of the people. People's sense of agency and ownership of that system, right? So it was very anti-clerical at one level, right? It's very kind of anti-orthodox at one level, right? But if you take these assumptions and then add a further assumption that the system of law, Sharia in this case, again being reductive, should be regarded as a kind of a scheme of emancipation. It can be reformed, it's a scheme of, but reference to that, that's a framework within which you operate. What kind of political system would be appropriate for that, right? And you got a standard set of combinations, which is at one level democracy, some form of representative government, but guided by some form of clerical establishment, right? Acknowledging the fact that Islam as an identity would have to be benchmarked in that constitution, because that's what makes it an Islamic, right? And forms of policies that strive to restore the unity of experience. I mean very simplistic, but you get the broad point, right? It's remarkable how influential and consequential this framework was, right? I mean, in a sense, different ways from Pakistan to Iran, struggling with this combination of elements. But it's also fair to say that this project, and there was a political edge added onto this project if you actually add this idea that Islam as a kind of political idea is under danger in the modern world, right? This project is basically now sinking under the weight of its own contradictions all across the world, right? Right? The entire kind of crisis from sort of Iran to Egypt. Again, I mean simplifying, but there's a kind of normative vacuum there, right? It doesn't mean those regimes are going to collapse, but it does mean that this set of assumptions cannot provide a kind of legitimizing framework that has widespread consent.